It had been early in their relationship. They'd gotten into a fight. The fight itself was resolved, but he still felt as if he had lost her. He hadn't been so close to anyone in his life, and in his fear that this would be their last time, he let go. He truly enjoyed the moment, his last moments with her. Richard had torn into her flesh without a thought. He'd taken too much of her blood. By the time he'd realized what he had done, she lay limp in his arms. Panic swept over him. So many people had abandoned him over the years, but never before had he killed someone he cared about. He couldn't be responsible for her death. She could live with him or without him, all he wanted was for her to live. She needed blood. He opened his own vein, pressed it to her lips, and bowed his head in prayer. He knew it couldn't work, but he was beyond reason. Through his sacrifice, God would save her. His arm fell useless beside her. He was so weak. Was this the sensation he had heard about from those he met on their deathbeds? He'd met many in his youth, after the church took him in. They spoke of drifting, or of tunnels and lights. He knew what awaited him on the other side. Forgive me, Father. He'd wanted so desperately to be one of God's children, but the matrons soon noticed he was different. They could tell in time that he didn't age like the other children, and that people around him tended to end up dead or disappeared. He had tried to talk to them at times about his calling, but that only made it worse. No matter what he did, he had always been a pariah. A devil, to hear them talk. Maybe they were right. What would Molly say? For the first time in his life, that dark thought crossed his mind. What would it be like to die? He wondered. Surely he would see her again soon. God would forgive his mistake. He closed his eyes. It wouldn't be long. Molly gasped and seized upon his lap. He jerked awake and gripped her head in his hands. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot. Blood bubbled at the corner of her lip. He rocked her back and forth, weeping his praises to the ceiling, as she began to scream. He rocked her back and forth, weeping his praises to the ceiling, as she began to scream. Grendel still sat on the floor of the wagon. It had been a week since the performance, but even now he was so tired that standing felt like a chore. Turning someone was always draining, especially for him. It was easier to sit and wait. The few times he did get out of the wagon, everyone he met triggered memories that were not his own. He was in a strange position to know not only how Richard felt about his people, but how they felt about him in turn. Richard had no idea how much he meant to the people of his circus. Through their bond, he felt as though he knew Richard better than the man knew himself. Parts of the experience could be enjoyable, but they quickly lost their appeal with the passage of time. He lay in the dark as everyone else slept. He looked around the little wagon. Molly was still holding her ground, watching over Richard as he slept. He wanted to wake her so he had someone to talk to. He also wanted to kiss her, but he was sure it was just because he and her husband were emotionally linked. He found himself smiling. It was yet another thing Richard had no idea how to handle. Like Grendel, he could make others adore him without a word. He wondered what Richard would be capable of if only he knew how to use his power. Aside from the song of distant crickets, the air was still and quiet. Sleep wouldn't come. He thought about contacting Milo. Never in his thousands of years had he seen a change take this long. That would have been the responsible thing to do, but being this close to Richard, knowing his past, experiencing his feelings, he just couldn't. Milo would have done whatever he had to do if he thought Grendel was in trouble, and he wasn't willing to bet Richard's life on Milo arriving in a good mood. He wasn't sure when sleep finally took him, but he was soon awoken by Molly. "Drink," she said, offering him a battered tin cup. "You look tired." He averted his eyes and tried not to look, but took it with a smile of gratitude. "Well, isn't that nice of you? Where did you?" She held out a hand to silence him as she returned to her husband's side. "Ask me no questions and I will tell you no lies." He chuckled to himself. She truly thought it would matter to him where the blood came from. He couldn't remember a time when he was plagued by such questions of morality. She watched him drink, closing his eyes as he did, for a few silent minutes before speaking. "How old are you?" she asked quietly. Grendel laughed into his cup. "Not that old. I was around for a few important events. I wasn't keen on the idea of dirt, but no one ever listens to me," he said with a wink. She smiled, but she had other things on her mind. Does it ever bother you? Being what you are? That's a heavy question, he lied. Everything changes. What's right, what's wrong, how to think. After a few hundred years, it gets tiring. I follow my own moral compass. If feeding off humans, ones I have no fondness for, ones that have such small lifespans, is what keeps me going, well, it can't be that wrong. I have no pity or remorse for what I am. She looked at him in shock. So everyone is fair game. This time he did think about his answer before speaking. Mums, he said at last. I won't kill mums. They're important. Every child should have one. Molly found herself laughing. So you do have a soul. I don't see why I wouldn't. But why mothers, she pressed, studying him carefully. Did something happen to yours when you were young? He shook his head. No, she was around for most of my human life, and died in her sleep at the age of 46. That was really old, back then. He gave Molly one of his biggest fake smiles. No tragic backstory for me. She looked down at her husband. Everyone has a tragic past, even if it's just in their own mind. She stroked his forehead and her eyes began to shine in the low light. If you wake up, she whispered, I promise I'll be better to you. Something stirred within him, something borrowed from Richard. He would disagree with that statement, he said. He waved away her protests. I'm in his head. I already know what you're thinking, and he really doesn't care. Not anymore, anyway. He loves you more than anything. You cannot speak for him, she exclaimed, at the edge of tears. I just want him to wake up. So do I. He let his chin rest upon his knees. As long as he's like this, I'll keep getting flashes of his memories. She looked up at him curiously, and a parade of realizations left her cheeks red. Yes, I know about that too, he said with a smirk. I know how you found out about him, and how he turned you. But I also know how he feels about you, because I can feel it too. It's beautiful, Molly. Right now, you are the most precious thing in the universe, and I would do anything I can to keep you safe. She said nothing, but a tightening of her lips and a squeeze of her husband's hand were enough. He sighed. Part of him longed to be free of Richard's influence, but to feel like this wasn't so bad. It was good to love. He had cared for all his charges, but they all left in the end. He would build them up and they would leave him for bigger and better things. He didn't resent them for it, that was the whole point. He needed them to become strong, but for what? There was a reason, wasn't there? He thought of Richard, who believed in a God that had no presence in his life to give his daily life a reason to go on. Was he simply doing the same? After thousands of years, maybe he didn't need a reason. Maybe it just was. Turning takes longer for Kaw-sekhmu like Richard, he said finally. Especially one who's been around as long as he has, so be patient with him. He will wake up, and when he does, yours will be the first face he sees. He stretched out on the floor beside the bed. Speaking of which, it's not fun to go through, so be ready for. You know. She wiped her eyes and nodded. Yes, I remember how it felt, she said, trying to force a smile. Thank you for staying this year. He may be difficult, but I know he was grateful for it. Grendel reached up and patted her foot. He can thank me later. They both knew he wouldn't. The blood did him some good, but he still didn't feel like he was all there. The blood did him some good, but he still didn't feel like he was all there. It was like the strange state just outside of sleep where dreams and the waking world blend. He got up to stretch his legs. The sun gave him comfort, as did the noise of people scuttering around and animals voicing their thoughts on the day. Do you know if he'll be all right? It took him a moment to realize that the child was talking to him. It couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Who, Richard? Yeah, he just needs some rest. The boy nodded hopefully and watched the wagon, aimlessly tapping a stick against the ground. Grendel ruffled his hair. You seem to care quite a lot about him, he said. Why is that? The boy shrugged. He took me in. Gave me work. He hesitated for a moment. Made me feel like I'm wanted. Grendel nodded. He recognized the boy from his borrowed memories. He didn't stand out, but in Richard's mind, people were just people. Richard didn't realize that what to him was simply good business was a kindness to others. It's like this, the boy said suddenly. A bunch of people are scared of him, and he goes around like he owns the world, and, if he wanted to, I bet he could, but the thing is, he puts on this show that no one can touch. But when you get to know him, when he trusts you, you find out he's really kind and he's like a dad to me. A better one than mine ever was. The stick hit the ground hard enough to snap the tip off, sending it bouncing between the wheels of a wagon. He scrubbed his eyes, turning so Grendel couldn't see. And I just would feel bad if anything would happen to him, is all. Don't worry, Grendel said. I won't let anything happen to him. You've got my word. He ruffled the boy's hair. Besides, it's about time he got some rest. Are you his family? Grendel tipped his head to one side. Why? The boy pointed. Your eyes, he explained. He snorted. He hadn't changed them before he left the wagon. Milo always said it should be second nature, but it was just too much effort. People all look different anyway, so why shouldn't he? What about them? Richard's eyes do the same thing in the light. They get really big, but in the right light, he held up his hands and squeezed them together, they get all small, like a snake. Cat. The boy looked at him in confusion. Our eyes. They're not snake eyes. They're cat eyes. He gave the boy a wink and left him to his questions.